Hello, good afternoon and welcome to today's Inside Out talk from Leeds Beckett University, the Driverless City with Ron Henderson. The mission of our prestigious Inside Out lecture series is to bring the best minds of our generation to inspire and support the work students and staff do across Leeds School of Arts at Leeds Beckett University. My name is Marion Harrison, Senior Lecturer in Fine Art, and with my colleague, Dr. Alia Fadal, Lecturer in Landscape Architecture, we are delighted today to be hosting today's talk with Ron Henderson. Ron is Professor and Director of the Master of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism Program at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, which is where he joins us from today. Ron will talk for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, followed by Q&As, and Alia will be chairing the quick Q&As with Ron. So if you have a question, please use the Slido website, www.slido.com, hashtag LBU capital -RH. So I will now hand you over to Dr. Alia Fadal to introduce Ron and his talk.
Thank you, Marion. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to our lecture today, the Driverless City Project, part of the Inside Out lecture series hosted by Leeds School of Arts and Leeds Beckett University. I'm very pleased to introduce and welcome our guest speaker for today, Professor Ronald Henderson. Professor Henderson is joining us from Chicago, a wonderful city. He is Professor and Director of the Landscape Architecture and Urbanism Program at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, USA, and has held previous appointments at Harvard, Pennsylvania State University, and several other academic institutions. He's founding principal at Lerio Landscape Architecture based in Newport, USA, whose work in North America, Asia, and Europe has been widely celebrated. His recent and current projects include the Gardens of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Newport Art Museum Campus in Town Spring, Elizabethan Theatre at Chateau d'Ardello, and the Memorial of the Abolition of the Slave Trade in France. Professor Henderson is Senior Fellow of Garden and Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks, a Japan USA Friendship Commission Creative Artist Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. He's author of The Gardens of Suzhou and contributed to The New Horizons, 8 Perspectives on Chinese Landscape Architecture Today, one of the American Society of Landscape Architects' best books in 2020. Today, Professor Henderson will share with us his lecture on Driverless City Project. The project investigates the critical link between the urban landscape and navigation safety of mobile co-robots, addressing questions of safety and trust in operating robots in dense urban environments by determining what changes to the urban infrastructure can increase safety, usability, and sustainability. We look forward to knowing more about this interesting and bold research project. So please join me to welcome our guest speaker for today, Professor Ronald Henderson, sharing with us his lecture on Driverless City Project. Welcome, Ron, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alia. And thank you also, Marion and Leeds Beckett, for the invitation. You know, it's always such a joy to be able to share some of the work that myself and my colleagues have been working on, and to do this with old friends and new friends. So I definitely want to thank you so much for the invitation to share this research. Maybe we could start the slides. Great. Go back. Sorry. Yes, this is great. So as I said, this has been many people working on this work. We have a National Science Foundation research grant. We received the Nair Prize research grant from IIT several years ago, and we have ongoing research with the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. So I've been working with Marshall Brown and Laura Forlano and Jack Guthman and Lily Dew and Boris Pervan and Matt Spenko and Nile Mystery and Alexis Arias and Iho Chen and Kana Nagai, Jorge Mayorga, Melika Yousefi, and Mahmoud Rahman, and others throughout this period. Next slide. You know, we're looking at the urban design implications of driverless cars. And we're often asked, well, what in the world can that be? How can that kind of technology impact cities? These are two images of the same place. On the left is the 1909 Burnham and Bennett plan, Chicago plan vision of the Civic Center of Chicago. On the right, after planning in the 1950s and 60s, this is what's now known as the Jane Byrne interchange, which is an intersection between two superhighways. This exchange of superhighways is exactly in the spot where the court of the Civic Center of Chicago had been planned for in the Burnham and Bennett plan. So if anybody has any questions about the implications of transportation policy, this is a pretty straightforward example of the way that this can impact our cities. And that's why we're doing this research. We're trying to see how we can work to plan and build policy and design strategies where this transition from driverless or to driverless cars, which also coincides with the transition from internal combustion engine to electrical engines, could direct the design of our cities to align with the values that we may hold as landscape architects, urban designers, planners, designers. Next slide. So the Driverless City Project will guide these professionals as we work to plan and design cities, and also because of our collaboration with navigation engineers and robotics engineers to help educate them on the implications of their work in the public realm. Next slide. And we've all seen visions of the future. So anytime we start to do drawings, we see how imaginative we've been over the last 100 years or 200 years about imagining the future. And so it doesn't always come true, but there are seeds of things that may be able to telegraph into the future. Next slide. We also understand that there's public concern and that there are issues. There's self-driving cars have been involved in accidents, including deadly accidents. We also know that there are implications. If we don't have drivers as a profession, many people will lose their jobs. So we're also aware of some of the downsides that we would also want to be careful to understand and recognize. Next slide. So the Driverless City Project is navigation, safety and risk, landscape architecture, urban design implications. Next slide. Our National Science Foundation grant is focused on State Street in Chicago. So you'll see State Street throughout this talk. Lake Michigan is to the upper right, so that's the shoreline, cutting from the upper left to the bottom right. In the green is the IIT campus, which is a low density, low profile building with a lot of open space, landscape. As you travel north into the South Loop, you get a more dense urban fabric. Then in the Loop, you get a very dense urban fabric. Crossing the Chicago River into River North, you start getting super tall urban fabric. And then in the Gold Coast, you get a dense urban residential fabric. So this transect of State Street is a very good site for us to study the implications, because we have different urban environments along a single transect. Next slide. And we're working primarily right now with roboticists and navigation engineers. Car navigation has two modes. One is GPS, which is satellite based, and one is LiDAR or sensor based, which is ground based. One of the issues with satellite navigation is when you get into the dense urban part of the city, the communication between the satellites and the cars is obstructed by the buildings, or on the right, sometimes the signals may bounce off of buildings and give improper locations, which is why on Google Maps in my apartment, Google Maps thinks I'm in Lake Michigan, but no, I'm not. I'm actually in my apartment. Next slide. And so we've worked as a team to begin to study where along State Street satellite navigation is compromised. For the most accurate locational coordinates, we need 4 satellites, X, Y, Z, and time. So anything above 4 is pretty good. So green, blue, and dark blue. So anything in the orange, red means that the car can't really communicate with the satellites, which means the cars drive on the sidewalk or so forth. Next slide. And then we've dynamically modeled some sites. So what you see on the right is over time, the satellites are moving around a spot on State Street. And it shows how patchy the signals are that would allow you to navigate safely. In the end, this is, about human safety and eliminating risk. Next slide. And then along State Street with IIT campus on the left and the Gold Coast on the right, you can see the satellite integrity. So the blue is good, so we can navigate by satellites, they're fine. But you can see with the profiles of the buildings, as they become denser, that becomes more risky. Next slide. And we're really interested right now in this transition zone when you go from GPS to LiDAR. At that point in time, the car is going to have to realize that it needs to shift its mode of navigation. Next slide. So if we look at this site, State Street is in the middle of the map on the left, and on the right is this kind of 2 blocks over the length of a day of the satellite visibility. So next slide. The top circle is around an overhead train track. And you can see where that train track is. The GPS satellite availability is just a stripe of orange. So there's never really any access to navigation by satellite. And then there's a dense urban block, which is the lower circle, which then projects to the right. And you can see how that also affects navigation over time. Next slide. And that's what this area looks like right now. Next slide. We've also been looking at how trees would or would not affect GPS navigation, and in fact trees do have a kind of flutter that does have an impact on the legibility of the the GPS. Next slide. So we've been working, this is a group of our students, measuring different canopy densities. So this has also started to move into you know, a very specifically landscape-based investigation. Next slide. What we've learned from LiDAR performance is that ground cover details are easier to see than trees. Dark colors may weaken confidence. Reflective street signs and paint are very effective for legibility. Mirrored surfaces can displace readings. Frosted glass diffuses signals. Tree trunks are very distinguishable, but not the canopy. So this is something that we're thinking about with LiDAR, and surface temperature has no real impact. Next slide. And so a different, you know, set of different species of trees, a kind of sense of their canopy density and how that may affect the legibility of trees, which we're investigating as potential landmarks to help navigate by LiDAR. Next slide. So as we're navigating in the city, and we've had to transition from GPS to LiDAR or sensor navigation, you know, we have medians and elevated train lines and tall buildings and lighting, and we have all of these things that are trying to teach the car to stay in its lane and not drive on the sidewalk. Next slide. But there are also places with open sky, like in a parking lot, where GPS might work. But again, I think once we get into the city, what we're discovering is probably that the satellite navigation may need to transition fully into ground-based sensing. Next slide. And of course, other complications in the city are that we have road work. Chicago, we definitely have climate, and then we just have events. You know, we give over the street to events, and so sometimes what might have been predicted has changed, either daily or seasonally or for events. Next slide. So in the city, what we're looking at, because I'm a landscape architect and we're working with roboticists and navigation engineers, is what would be the relationship between landscape and navigation safety. And our initial investigation was, can we use trees to help navigate cars? Okay, that sounds funny, right? It is and it isn't. In the simplest way, you could see a line of trees along the side of the road like a barcode with different spacing, different dimensions, different thicknesses. And then on the lower range, we might get other cars, we may get trees that are offset, we may get building facades and so forth. So there may be a more complex kind of sense of reading, more like a QR code. Next slide. So how do they navigate? It's mostly an array of sensors. There's the GNSS, which is satellite, LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which is ground-based, inertials, radar, high-def cameras, and then there's decision-making software. This is actually our test vehicle loaded up, and periodically we drive this up and down State Street. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. And we can get cloud, point cloud, LiDAR images. Next slide. And so ground-based, this is the same place, the photograph on the left and our LiDAR image on the right. And what you can see on the right is kind of like what the car is seeing. And you can see street lights, you can see tree trunks. So these are really critical landmarks that might help the car read and see, like a QR code, where it is. And these patterns would be distinct everywhere in the world, almost like fingerprints. Next slide. And we've been doing tree recognition algorithms. Next slide. In this, you can see the circle would be like a car driving down the road, and all of the red pieces would be trees as we're starting to recognize those landmarks to help us navigate. Next slide. So we're driving down State Street headed north, just getting ready to pass the student center, which is the gray footprint on the right. Getting ready to cross 33rd Street. The red dots are trees. Next slide. And I should note that's from the research of a visiting scholar, Bao Ru Ching, from Xi'an. We've also used this research as a basis for our landscape architecture plus urbanism design studios. This is a studio led by Professor Nilay Mistry a couple of years ago. Next slide. With three basic questions. How can urban public spaces be designed to serve human needs and social equity during increased growth of autonomous vehicles? How can landscape architects, planners, and architects employ the latest developments in mapping, tools, and navigation software in understanding and creating design interventions? And what design opportunities exist between balancing autonomous vehicle navigation and meaningful civic spaces? Next slide. Here we are in Crown Hall. Alia will recognize this very well. With a long plot of State Street with a series of student investigations into how the street could be transformed through a design process looking at civic values, navigation, safety, and autonomous vehicles. Next slide. So again, Lake Michigan is at the top. The purple line is State Street. The white block is a parking lot that you'll see here in a little bit. Next slide. So clearly, if autonomous vehicles, they may not need to park. They can drop you off at your house or your workplace and then go pick up someone else, or they could go to a car storage unit. So much of our public space is dedicated to parking cars in Chicago. If we could eliminate some of that parking area, because the driverless cars don't have to sit there and wait for you, you can summon them and they'll come get you. What might we do with that space? So these are some examples. This is Valerie Clark's work, looking at ecological recharge. We have a very serious water management problem in Chicago that pollutes the lake and pollutes the rivers. So if we could handle some of that water more locally in the streets, that would create an overall impact on water quality and water quantity management. Next slide. The other thing is that over the 20th century, we progressively organized our streets. So if, in 1900, if you were in a street anywhere in the world, there would have been horses and bicycles, maybe a few cars full of people. We call that a swarm, right? The street would have just been full of people moving anywhere they want. By the time we got to the end of the 20th century, people were walking in this line, bicycles were in this line, buses were in this line, cars were in this line. So over the 20th century, we organized the experience of our cities in a series of parallel lines, depending on what mode of transportation you were using. The driverless cars, because, you know, they shouldn't hit people, you know, so those kinds of injuries should trend towards zero, means that we could loosen up that structure of the city again. And that's what Liu Bin was investigating here. Next slide. Next slide. And then what does that mean if we also combine that with less car storage, car parking on the streets? And so Liu Bin here is looking at the transformation of a street into more generous pedestrian areas, bioswales, bike lanes, increased public transitions between public and private front yards. Next slide. This is in the Gold Coast. Then the next investigation was looking at this parking lot. The purple stripe is State Street. You can see the parking lot just to the right. Next slide. Next slide. And again, Liu Bin looking at this as a commercial hub where driverless vehicles could be stored, but they could also, it's almost like could think of it almost like a bus station for driverless cars, except they could also pick up produce and other things. So it's, you know, could be a kind of mashup of supermarket, Amazon, driverless cars, storage, and transportation center. So imagine you're getting ready to get off work and you want a driverless car to come pick you up to take you home. You also tell the car to stop here and get milk and eggs. And so they can load that into the car. The car can then go pick up your child at daycare, then come get you from work and take you home. So, you know, what kind of new hybrid kinds of commercial and social programs may happen because of driverless cars? So this is one of the things that Liu Bin was looking at. Next slide. And of course, we have drones also. That's somebody else can do that research. Next slide. And Valerie took the same site and looked to increase urban biomass. And how could we do the similar kinds of programming, but also increase tree canopy? Next slide. And next slide. Next slide. Designing for people in autonomous features. Next slide. We've been working with a group of different universities, different disciplines, external collaborators. Next slide. And we do a lot of this, kind of a lot of the what ifs. What if cars could interface with motels? What if a car was a motel? If it's a driverless car and you're taking a long trip, can you figure out a way that, you know, the driverless car may dock or something like that? Next slide. But for us, some of the big what ifs are just, what if there's more space on streets for environmental services, like water infiltration, urban heat island effect remediation, urban tree canopy, and carbon sequestration. Next slide. You know, for carbon sequestration, you know, Elon Musk said he'd give $100 million for the best prize for carbon capture. Of course, we know what that answer is already. I'll take the $100 million, but I'm not the only one. There's, it's a pretty obvious answer we already have. Next slide. So we've been looking at how our research on autonomous vehicles could have probably something that few people would think about in terms of the potential to also lead to policies or couple with policies that could capture carbon and grow the urban forest. Next slide. This research is led by Alexis Arias Betancourt, our PhD research assistant, who I believe is listening in, so I hope I'll represent this well. Next slide. So if we go back to our State Street LiDAR representation, we see that the areas in blue are low integrity navigation areas, and the areas in orange and yellow are areas where the GPS navigation is fairly good. So one strategy for the landscape is how can we make the GPS navigation better? Next slide. So we took one space. This again is right in front of the Student Center at IIT. Next slide. Where we're also doing running algorithms to also see where there's navigation risk. Next slide. And we identified a space where there weren't any landmarks. And so what would happen if we added trees to that site? So on the right, kind of representation of adding 3 trees. Next slide. And click. So we planted 3 trees. This is our IIT MLA plus U program annual graduation trees. So we plant trees for graduation every year. And so we planted these trees for the Driverless City Project. Next slide. There with the polka dot face of Mies at the entry to the MTCC. Next slide. And so we're actually testing on the IIT campus how this might work. More broadly, looking at the city of Chicago, what might be the implications of being able to add more trees for landmark navigation? Next slide. The loop only has about 8% tree canopy. There are other parts of the city, maybe 21% or more. The economic benefits are in the millions of dollars. So in addition to all the other things that trees do, we're also looking at the economic impact. Next slide. And we've done comparisons with New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Next slide. So in Chicago, next slide. The canopy coverage is about 17%. I think most research tells us that around 30 to 33% canopy coverage is when we begin to get a really a good maximization of the impact of urban forests. But you can see how diverse that density is across the city. Next slide. So some of these benefits, everything from pollution removal, urban heat island, and energy, have also been calculated, but we focused a little bit on carbon sequestration. About 21 million tons annually, which equates to a little bit over 500,000 tons a year, $4 billion in total. Next slide. Obviously, areas with commercial and industrial activities are not as dense. So downtown Chicago, just there to the left of where it says Lake Michigan, is the least dense. So building density goes up, tree density goes down. Building density goes down, tree density goes up. No surprise. Next slide. And we've also then broken it down into neighborhoods. So the North Park neighborhood has one of the highest tree densities in the city. Below the lowest bubble, Douglas, that's where IIT is. Our tree canopy is maybe 19%, and then in the loop it's as low as 10%. Next slide. Within the city of Chicago, public parks only cover about 6% of the territory. So on the right, the diagram is the outline of the city of Chicago. The green hatch represents, the combined area of park. The gray hatch is streets. It's, we kind of have to remind ourselves that streets are the largest public space in almost every city in the world, and that they're a key part of the work that landscape architects do. They are the largest civic and public spaces. So all of this amount of territory, I think, is a landscape architecture problem, and I think that's why we're, so much of the work on this grant and this research on the Driverless City Project is focused on the street as a social space. Next slide. And again, there's a little bit of an unequal distribution of parks across the city. Next slide. And so when we start to come back down from looking at the city to again looking at specific streets, you see on the left the IIT campus, like I was saying, dense trees, not so dense buildings. On the right, the loop, dense buildings and very few trees. Next slide. So this segment of State Street, this is the current condition that we've modeled. And if we come back to the question of navigation, this was one of the areas where we discovered that LiDAR ground-based sensing could use more navigation. Next slide. So we also recognize that this is an area where we could add more tree canopy, which would also help the cars navigate. Next slide. As a consequence, we also went from this heat island model, urban heat island model, where you can see there's quite a bit of heat. Next slide. But with the addition of the canopy, the urban heat island becomes less severe. So what we're trying to quantify and demonstrate is that landscape can help cars navigate, but we can also increase biodiversity. We can also decrease urban heat island. We can also sequester carbon. There's a series of values and achievable conditions that we can support. And so our research is helping to make that case. Next slide. And then urban air quality has a similar kind of issue where trees can help with the urban air quality. There are areas around airports, areas around interstate highways, or areas around industrial zones that have bad air quality. Next slide. And then lastly, and I think we're coming fairly close here, probably have about 10 more slides. We've also been looking at the implications to urban waters, and this is specifically through the grant that Alexis and I got from the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Next slide. Next slide. The socio-environmental implications of urban waters in the driverless city. So we've looked at trees, now we're going to look at water. Next slide. And again, it's one of these questions like what in the world could be the implications to water on driverless cars or electric vehicles? Well, on the left is a gas station, petrol station. Well, we know what the implications have been for gasoline in urban environments. I'm working on a project in Newport, Rhode Island, where the historic water supply for the city, the original fresh spring, became a Superfund contaminated site because the tanks of the gas station leaked into the groundwater. So I don't think that anyone who was planning what the implications of the transition from horses to automobiles would have foreseen, years ahead, that would have an implication, profound implication, on urban groundwater quality. So we're trying to think what the implications are to undo some of these problems, to foresee problems that we may not be thinking about now, but also make places for people. Next slide. Including, pretty significant historic architecture. This is in Chicago. As we transition from internal combustion engine to electric cars, what's going to happen to these and other gas stations around the city, at least in the US, some of which are the only sources of food in neighborhoods that don't have grocery stores. They're social centers in rural areas. What would happen with all of these gas stations? Next slide. For this research, what Alexis has done is have a series of interviews with thinkers from around the world, and asking them that sort of confounding question is, what would the implications to water be with driverless cars? Next slide. I will be compiling these into a publication. Next slide. So Ricky Burdett, maybe some of you know Ricky. So we have someone in the UK. We have a Londoner here. Ricky said, like heart transplants or replacing a knee, the city is the same thing, and our resilience to adaptation is extraordinary. And he means this both in the physical form, but also in the policy level. There's a long way to go, as he says, to train the next generation of occupants of our cities, as well as urban designers and landscape architects, to deal with water and a lot of extraordinary opportunities within these new technologies. Next slide. Mary Pat McGuire, a landscape architect, talks about sponge streets and removing pavement and connecting stormwater systems into larger pieces, connecting landscapes that are broken and fragmented due to urbanization. Catherine O'Connor, who leads the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District here in Chicago, talks about if we can capture some of the water locally when it rains, it won't override the sewer system, which then would cause contamination and flooding downstream. So if we can keep some of the water in the street, it's better than keeping it in someone's basement, and it's better than flooding. So if we can use some new space in the street for water, that would be great. And then Jeremy Glover at the Metropolitan Planning Council here in Chicago talks about who owns the street, who gets the right to the street. You know, is it pedestrians? Is it people on bicycles? Is it children wanting to play in the street? And it could be an incredible thing for cities to rethink where we've gotten ourselves to at the end of the 20th century and the early 21st century. Next slide. So water in our streets, flooding in basement, water quality concerns. You know, this is just the extent of the problem in Chicago. You know, something like 15,000 calls over the year. So divide that by 365 days a year, you know, and there's, I don't know, 50 calls a day or something like that on average in Chicago with concerns about water. Next slide. So if we just look at parking and only street permit parking spots, which these are, if you live on that block, you get a permit to park on that block. This isn't metered parking or parking meters. It's not free parking, which exists in some areas, or it's not bus zones. It's only where there are parking spots with permits. There are over 200,000 of those spots, which is 841 linear miles of permit street parking. Next slide. And you could drive from Brighton to the Orkneys to give you a sense of scale of take a 3-meter wide line and just go all the way across the island, right? For us in the US, next slide, that would connect Chicago to New York. So the scale of the opportunity is not small. This is an incredible potential. Next slide. So what if driverless cars don't need parking and street parking can be retrofitted for social and environmental purposes? Next slide. We can get things like this. We can make room for more bicycles. We can make rooms for vegetable gardens. We can make room for street fairs and social activities. Next slide. So we've started to look at a module. So, you know, in a situation like this, sidewalk and street, the current infrastructure, there's about 800 square feet of impermeable surface, which creates 26 gallons per minute of water runoff. If we retrofit the same area, we can reduce the water runoff to 21 gallons. So maybe it's a 20% savings just within the parking area. Next slide. And if we project that across the city, you know, we get somewhere, you know, reduction of a little bit over 1 million gallons per minute. Next slide. And in closing, I'm just going to show one scenario. This was a scenario developed during the Nair Prize research led by Nilay Mistry. Next slide. Which begins to encapsulate many of these issues. This is the intersection of State Street. You can see on the left, cutting across diagonally to the lower right. The gray line is the green line L, the Chicago train system, and then 33rd Street moves kind of in the middle from the top to the bottom. And on the left corner of that intersection, you can see a tower. That's the administration tower at IIT. So the lower quadrant, which is the northwest, is IIT. The northeast is High School De La Salle Academy. The upper right is our Chicago Police Headquarters, and which would be to the southeast, and to the southwest is a housing and commercial neighborhood. Next slide. Everything in pink is parking. right now. And you can see the green line L cutting through there. Next slide. With the L station being right there. So again, to the upper left is IIT, to the right is a high school, to the lower right is the police station and all of their parking, and to the bottom left is a neighborhood. Next slide. And so we were looking at how to integrate public transit, because there's a lot of concern that driverless cars will eliminate public transit or will reduce use of public transit. Driverless cars can be programmed to move. So imagine in this scenario, at the end of the day, the kids in the high school get off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 2:45, 15 minutes before the end of class, the cars in the parking lot are programmed to move so that the basketball courts open up for the kids to play basketball or to play on the playground. So the driverless cars can move to make space for other programs and other activities. Because the cars don't hit people, we may not need to keep the cars specifically in their lane, right? We may get back to that early 20th century idea of a swarm, and so the cars can move around. We also have the potential for car storage. And this comes back to that model where you could link, say if you did not live near the mass transit, you could take a driverless car to the train station, get on the train, the car would be stored or parked there. When you come home, you could get on the train, again, tell the car to load up with milk and eggs, and by the way, pick up your child at the high school and your spouse that works at IIT, and you all would converge around a kind of work, trade, transportation center that's localized in neighborhoods. Next slide. And spatially, the potential to kind of break the curb line in our urban environment is one of the things that I think we're looking at spatially in terms of urban design. New soft edges for city blocks may provide more dynamic and inhabitable spaces than the kind of hard-edged curbs, parkways, and sidewalks of the 20th century. Next slide. And we can work on flexible programming because of the mobility of the driverless cars. Next slide. And next slide. As good scholars, our bibliography is here and credits. We've learned so much in this process from so many people. Next slide. So the Driverless City investigates the urban design implications of driverless and autonomous vehicles. Next slide. Designing for people in autonomous futures. Next slide. And transforming 20th century transportation infrastructure into 21st century human infrastructure. Next slide. The Driverless City. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ron, for sharing with us your great lecture on Driverless City Project. Very, very interesting, timely, and bold topic, raising many questions about ethical responsibility and the role of landscape architects, and urban designers on how to employ the latest developments in mapping tools and navigation software while creating design interventions to serve human needs, temporal activities, and associated environmental impact. So thank you again. This was wonderful. For our attendees, please share with us your questions to Ron about the Driverless City project. And well, Ron, the first question that comes to my mind is, how can we protect the human agency, which you kind of touched base into this during your lecture, but I would really like to know more about what do you think of how we can protect the human agency of the urban fabric while employing the robotic advanced technology? And could we achieve and maintain this humanistic balance between mechanically and mathematically calculated robotic systems from a side, and the sociocultural dynamics and uncertainty of urban population patterns of activities from the other side, like the impact of street life, for instance? Ron, please, can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Is that okay? You know, one of the dystopian visions is, of course, that the machines get smarter than us. And you know, I think for you know, for us, the ability to well, probably the person that we've worked with the most who looks at human machine interface is Laura Forlano here at IIT in the ID department. And you know, she's been doing a tremendous amount of research about, you know, kind of cyborg bodies. You know, many of us have an implant here or there, and you know, and so in some ways our bodies are already starting to be mechanized in some ways. So there's the kind of bodily relationship between machines and humans, but there's the spatial interchange between machines and humans. And you know, like I said, in the 20th century, we segregated those because the machines were dangerous. So people had to be on sidewalks and cars had to have a curb, so we could understand and define that space where, you know, a car belongs here. If you're walking, you have to be careful when you cross the curb. And similarly, the cars should stay off of the sidewalk. And so I think what we're imagining is that distrust in the urban environment may shift. Right now, I think many people are scared of driverless cars, that they're just going to go out of control without human agency. How are we going to protect each other? On the other hand, there are so many injuries and deaths in that situation. Why should we accept that as okay? So I think there's a transition in fear and risk. The upside may be very, very positive if we get to a situation where the cars can recognize and be programmed to protect us. So maybe optimistically, we're hoping that that could be one of the ways in which the urban environment can be transformed.
Thank you,
Ron. But many people are still very scared of that transition.
Yeah, that's very true. This taking us to another quite relevant question, since we are talking about this. It came from two questions from Beth and Faye, two of our students. They're saying there are a lot of misleading narrative ideas about autonomous technology. Some may find it difficult to completely trust a self-controlled robot to get them from point to another without faults in the system. In case of an error, will the problem be human error or computer error? And how do you think it is best to go about reshaping the image of technology in the eyes of the general public?
Yes, you know, this is where, you know, in the Nair Prize research, we had an attorney on the team. We had a legal expert whose expertise was land use. You know, and he said for municipalities, as they're working to make space for driverless cars and allow driverless cars into the city, the legal aspects were really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Because who is responsible? Is Elon Musk responsible? Is the rider? We won't call them drivers anymore. You're not driving. You're just a rider. You know, if it's a mechanical error, can the machine be held responsible? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that question is actually being worked out in legal terms and in insurance terms, because in fact there's the legal aspect and then there's the economic mm-hmm. and monetary aspect. So insurance companies are involved in risk. That's what they do. So, you know, will we need car insurance as an individual in a driverless car? Or, you know, because how could we be held responsible? We're just riding along in the car. And so I think those questions get embodied in other professions and other modes of inquiry. You know, and then specifically to the question about how we learn to trust. Mm-hmm. We had a discussion with an executive at Toyota, and they said that they have much more technology than they release every year because we haven't learned to trust the new technology step by step by step. So, you know, I remember driving before cruise control. Then we got cruise control, and it took a while for all of us to feel like, okay, I can take my foot off the accelerator and the car will keep going. Now we have cruise control that monitors the car in front of us, which means that we don't even have to turn it off and on. It'll automatically slow down so we don't run over the car in front of us. So that's a good example of how the automakers are actually careful to roll out new technology so we get used to a kind of step-by-step progression. And that's ongoing. They just keep putting it out in front of us, and we keep accepting it step by step rather than just all at once.
Excellent. That sounds very interesting and relevant to another question from one of our attendees. How are car manufacturers engaging with and reacting to this research? Yeah, so that's quite relevant. Yeah,
and I think you know, I think the manufacturers are interested in the technology, and of course they're businesses, so they're interested in market share and but in our conversations with a few, not a lot, and mostly at places like car shows, the social implications and for sure the kind of urban social implications of their technology is not something that they think about very much at all. Apart from, you know, the electric car manufacturers trying to figure out where they can get charging stations. So it's kind of no different than the early internal combustion engine people. They had to figure out where the gas stations were going to be so that the cars could keep going. I think right now there's an obsession in the urban environment and by politicians and policymakers and urban designers, where can we put a gang of charging stations so that we can facilitate this transition.
Well, thank you, Ron. So to another question.
All good questions.
Oh, thank you. Another question from our colleague Muhammad Talgani. He's asking, traffic jams and idling contribute significantly to the urban heat island effect in city centers. Do you think the idea of driverless cities with more advanced or electric vehicles could be a solution to have cooler cities?
Yes, and the that question of traffic jams and kind of traffic flow. I learned a lot from my colleague Lily Dew, who's a transportation engineer who was part of the earliest research. And her research was on the space between the front bumper of a trailing car and the back bumper of a leading car. So that space. With driverless cars and sensing, those cars may be able to travel inches apart. Whereas human perception, we leave, I don't know, a car length or more. And so in terms of density, the cars could travel more closely together. So the capacity of the road to hold more cars more closely together may work. So instead of a 2-lane road with humans perceiving the distance, we might be able to reduce that to 1 lane of a road because the driverless cars can travel more closely. On long distance trips, we may put in our Google map and we follow. So our car knows where we're wanting to go. There may be instances where, if you all are traveling, leaving Leeds to go to London, what is that? Is that the M1? If you wanted to go and you get on the highway and 7 other cars are also going to Paddington, wherever, they would know, they would tell each other, and you all would group together. You might even have magnetic bumpers and you connect by magnetic bumpers. So then you can power down because you've made a train. And you could use less energy, travel together. So there are scenarios where, we can make a transition where there can be urban heat island effects, energy savings, etc. Whether those develop, the future will tell us.
Thank you, Ron.
I mean, wouldn't that be fun to just get out on the highway and all of a sudden you've oh, these other people are going to Paddington too, and we lock up together and power down a little bit and we travel as a train down the highway.
Yeah, just a lot of trust, I guess.
It is. This is where it is. It's risk and trust. Yeah.
Thank you, Ron. So there is another really interesting question from Hannah and Sophia. If vehicles are constantly on the move, would this be bad for the environment? And as the use of more technology implies an increase in power consumption, can the development of sustainable energy keep up with the technological advances of driverless cities?
Can you say that question one more time?
Oh, yes, sure.
Yes.
So the first bit is saying if vehicles are constantly on the move, would this be bad for the environment?
I mean, yes, because they're using energy, right? We know that there's a correlation between environmental quality and energy. We know that energy is an environmental concern. So if the vehicles are constantly on the move, then yes, they're using more energy and there would be an environmental concern. For electric vehicles, that means the environmental concern is the generation of electricity in power plants and extraction of coal or nuclear or water, whatever that source of energy is. You know, the possibilities of wind and solar energy has the potential to continually reduce that, but the, you know, solar energy still needs batteries, and batteries take, you know, precious earth metals and so forth. So that's always, you know, that energy is such a key part of all of this, for sure.
Thank you, Ron. So the second bit was from Sophia, and as the use of more technology implies an increase in power consumption, can the development of sustainable energy keep up with the technological advances of driverless cities?
Yeah, I think that's a policy question, right? Although I will say there's another scenario, and this is just us playing around, but both yes and no. So last year in the state of Texas, there was an ice storm, and it knocked out the electrical power throughout the state for a couple of days. Well, there's a new F-150 Ford pickup truck, which Americans love to drive, big pickup trucks, that's electric. And not only does the pickup truck, you know, need to plug in order to get its power, it also has a generator where the truck can also serve as an energy source. So Texans who had a big Ford pickup truck that was electric literally plugged their house into the truck to keep their freezers running and keep their air conditioning running and keeping, or whatever they needed to keep running. So I would say we should not only think of the vehicles as using power. In the future, they may actually be the power. This is a big shift, right? Maybe through the friction of tires going down the road, they can generate their own power. Maybe they have solar roofs and they can generate their own power. We may actually come and plug our house. We may actually drive our car to our houses to actually power our houses. Then we could get rid of power plants. So, you know, a crazy model is that our vehicles become localized personal generators of power.
Excellent, sounds very interesting. Thank you, Ron. So to another couple really interesting questions from Richard and Molly. The first question is, what physical changes will be required to optimize streets for autonomous vehicles and robots? And the follow-up question on this, and how will the driverless city balance the repurposing of space? Like, would the priority be for economic, nature, public, or housing?
As I said, streets are the largest public space in almost every city, and it's very contested real estate. You know, cities want to make money by charging for parking. So if we don't have parking, you know, the cities aren't making that money, that revenue from parking. So there may be conflicting values. There may be areas where making a place for children to play is a priority. There may be places where one does an analysis of flooding and that there's a neighborhood in the city where managing water in the street may be the priority. So I think I would hope that it's a more localized solution based upon social and environmental needs at a more finely grained scale than a kind of blanket urban policy. That's my general preference in urban design anyway, is that there's specificity to places that may have different priorities, different needs than other places.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. That's very important when we talk about not to turn it into like mechanical, predetermined design. It's very site-specific and very human-specific as well. So, shall we take another question? Okay, so there is a question from Richard and Hannah asking about what part will autonomous vehicles play in overall transport strategies and mass transit system? And could driverless buses or similar communal vehicles be more efficient?
Yes. You know, many of us who work in urban environments, work in cities, understand the amazing role that public transportation plays in helping people move across the city. Uses less energy, more economical, more equitable. The train, bus infrastructure, especially trains, it's a fixed infrastructure asset. It can't move. So if you're not in a place that's close to that, it's hard for you to use that, or you need another step to get from your home to the mass transit. And so that kind of last mile strategy, as some people call it, is a really critical issue where perhaps driverless cars could set up a system to bring people to mass transit. And of course, mass transit could be driverless too. We've probably all been at an airport on a bus that doesn't have a driver or on a monorail that doesn't have a driver. And so we probably, many of us have already been in a driverless vehicle. We just kind of forget about it. Or we think there's a driver, but then when we realize there isn't, it doesn't seem to bother us. And so there's one way of thinking about the mass transit relative to the existing infrastructure. There's another way to think about it, which is what would the new infrastructure be with driverless autonomous vehicles? Could we think of that as a more mobile infrastructure that would provide mass transit services in a more door-to-door situation than door travel to mass transit, travel on mass transit, travel to work or play? Because I think that there's a convenience, there's a safety, there's any number of reasons why door-to-door has some preferences. Sometimes it's time. So how can we, one, imagine a new infrastructure of mass transit, but two, also figure out how we can integrate that with the existing investment that so many cities have in their mass transit.
Excellent.
There are a lot of people that are very concerned that mass transit will degrade. And again, I think there are policies and strategies and incentives that can be made so that we continue to not only use mass transit, but maybe even make it even more successful and for more people.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, so there will be a question from Faye and questions from Faye and Hannah about how important the use of public transport is, similar to what you discussed, Ron. But how about about the flexibility and individuality of personal needs? Like if a person going on holiday, will the car stay with them or just drop them and then leave? What would be the scenario?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, it could absolutely be that. You know, maybe you don't own a car, maybe you have a subscription to Tesla, and you have 100 credits a month that you pay for. And maybe day to day, if you're just an individual going from home to work, you take a very small car, you take a Mini Cooper, the Mini Cooper comes and picks you up, and those take, 1 credit a day or something like that. But you and your family want to go to the beach on the weekend, and you need a bigger vehicle. So maybe you need to get a Range Rover. I'll keep using British cars. And because you need beach balls and you've got the family, and maybe that's 5 credits an hour or 5 credits a day or something like that. So then you can calibrate your automobile use or your vehicle use depending on what you need to use it for. Instead of buying the Range Rover because you're going to go to the beach with the family once a month, and you're going to need something that size, but you end up driving it to work anyway, even though you don't need it, there could be some way then that you get flexibility in the kind of vehicle that you need for the situation. I think there's also another condition that we haven't mentioned that I might kind of end with is the one thing about driverless cars is that you don't have to be a driver. So it means if you are aged at a point where your family takes your keys away from you because your ability to drive is impaired, driverless cars could keep you mobile because you don't have to have those facilities. If you have sight impairments or any other kind of constraints that prohibit you from being in a car and being the primary, navigator of that vehicle, it's an incredible potential to make transportation more equitable and more durable through our lives. Now, of course, the one question is, what's the youngest child that you would put in a car? Will you put a 6-month-old in the car to drive it over to grandmother's house? I don't know. But this is going to be another one of those risk factors. But really, one of the really big upsides is the potential for those who don't have the ability physically to be drivers would still maintain and have access to an incredible amount of mobility.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Ron. And as we are concluding our event, I would like to thank you again for wonderful talk and your patience with all of the questions that we have, and for sharing with our Leeds Beckett community and beyond such wonderful and bold theme of the Driverless City project. And I also would like to thank our students and attendees for the excellent questions, and hand over to Marion.
Thank you, a huge thank you, Ron, from myself as well, for giving your time and joining us all the way from Chicago. And Alia and Ron, I know you know each other previously, so really great to see the conversation between the two of you and the great questions from the students. And I, just to second what Alia says, thank you for sharing that with our research community here at Leeds Beckett University, and hopefully this will continue the conversation across the departments. It's really fantastic, so thank you very much. And also thank you as always to our fantastic event support team for producing today's talk, and to all of you for attending. Just to again draw your attention just to the next Inside Out that's coming up on the 16th of March with Catherine Bond-Stockton. I was a queer child and so were you, and the links will be, Eventbrite links will be circulated in shortly. So that leaves me just to say thank you very much again. Thank you, Ron. Have a really good day, rest of your day as yours is starting. And thank you, Alia, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be a part of this program.